Let's now get reaction from the SNP, from Richard Thomson, the economic spokesman for the SNP in Westminster. Welcome to you. First of all, your response to what you heard from Jeremy Hunt.
Well, I think my response is one overwhelmingly of disappointment. I think that anybody who woke up this morning worried about how they were going to pay their bills and find their way through the cost of living crisis over the next few months and years ahead, it will still be left wondering that, because the fundamental fact of this is that for all the increases in spending in cash terms that were announced by the Chancellor today, they're being eclipsed by the inflation rate that's hit an 11.1%, a 41-year high today, it's been announced. So the purchasing power of any extra money that the Chancellor is announcing is being more than eroded by that state with inflation.
Now, you say disappointment, Richard, but you will have heard Jeremy Hunt announce an extension, a continuation of support in terms of the energy price guarantee, albeit, yes, a little bit higher, but it is going to continue for another year, and then targeted support for people who are on means-tested benefits, for pensioners and to those on disability. Presumably you welcome that.
Well, it's better than if it wasn't happening at all, but it's still only a mitigation, a partial mitigation of the increased costs that people are facing.
As a result of global headwinds, we heard from Jeremy Hunt there, those global headwinds, the Office for Budget Responsibility agrees that that is the main root cause of the high inflation.
It's not the only cause of
no,
it, though, and there are a few self-inflicted wounds like the Liz Truss quasi-quartering budget.
Yes, but they've unwound. They've unwound pretty well all of that.
And also Brexit certainly isn't diminishing those headwinds. So, you know, let's not let the government entirely off the hook that this is entirely down to global factors. But in terms of who picks up the bill for this, the Chancellor's aim was, or his words sadly didn't match up to the actions, because there were a number of measures that three measures he could have taken which would have placed the burden of the taxation onto the broadest shoulders. One of those would have been expanding the windfall tax, so it wasn't just about oil, gas and energy companies and expanding it to big retailers like Amazon.
They have expanded it quite significantly, haven't they, Richard Thomson? They are going to be bringing in the region of £14 billion.
Well, they could have done that. They could also have taxed non-DOMs. That might not have made them very popular with his next-door neighbour.
And that would have raised about £3.2 billion.
That would have raised the £3.2 billion, which isn't currently being raised. And they could also, if they taxed share buybacks, that could have raised approximately another £11 billion. So in a £55 billion consolidation package, as it was being put, split 50-50 between spending cuts and increased taxes, straight away, even just with the last two measures I've mentioned, that's the core of about £15 billion that could have been raised without having to increase the tax burden on some of the people who are least able to afford that.
Right, but the consensus, if you remember, the mini-budget that you talked about earlier from Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, the increased amount in borrowing, much of it unfunded tax cuts as the markets viewed it, but the largest amount fiscally was the energy intervention, the energy price guarantee. Rishi Sunak said that the plans to increase borrowing were risky and even immoral. The SNP, you, on the other hand, said Liz Truss wasn't borrowing enough. Your leader at Westminster, Ian Blackford, said that Liz Truss's plan to cap energy bills fell far short of the help we need, even though it was probably, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, one of the most expensive policies in modern political history.
Well, the borrowing in and of itself needn't necessarily have been a problem. It was the fact that there was no clear plan for how that was going to be consolidated through the tax base. That was what gave the fright to the markets, and that's the price that we're still paying through interest rates that are higher than they would otherwise be, which also means that any of the spending increases in cash terms rather than real terms announced by the Chancellor simply aren't going nearly as far as they need to go. But in terms of spreading that burden, there's a couple of measures there in terms of the share buybacks, taxing and tackling non-DOMs would have spread that burden far more equitably. But of course, it is that the energy costs that are building much of the inflation that's there. It's increasing costs for businesses. It's driving through into the costs for food and drink. And that is what's really hammering families at the lowest end of the income scales there. And that's why much more needed to be done today in order to put money in people's pockets and to spread the burden equitably. Sadly, that is not what happened.
Richard Thomson, thank you very much.